Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Author's Cut. I am Tabitha Lord from Book Club Babel, and I am so pleased tonight to welcome Jennifer Kitsis, and she's going to talk a little bit about her book, Small Hours, and we're going to have a fun conversation this evening. A few housekeeping tips. If you're joining us on the webinar, you are able to send me questions. If you hover your mouse over your bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat feature. Shoot me a question, and I will work it into our interview this evening. We are streaming live on Facebook. We'll be posting to YouTube and to the Book Club Babel site as soon as we're finished here. So Jennifer, welcome to Book Club Babel and the Author's Cut. So happy to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself? And I know that you've had an interesting career history, and that Small Hours, the book we're going to talk about tonight, is your debut novel. So tell us a little bit about you.
Okay. Let's see. Well, this is my debut novel. I started working on it when my daughters were 3 years old. They're twin daughters, like the couple has in this book. And at the time I started working on it, I was freelancing and I was taking care of them at the same time. So a lot of those pressures or different things I was trying to manage wound up going into the book. I'm from a journalism background. I was a Newswire reporter for about 5 years at Bloomberg News. So there are also a lot of newsroom scenes in the book. Let's see, what else? I still write professionally on the side.
Okay.
And, but I've been trying to write, well, I was trying to write a different novel before this for years. So this was kind of like a dream come true in a way to finally get a novel to come together and to have it come out.
It's tricky, isn't it? It's a lot more work than anybody thinks, you know. I was just writing a blog post today. I write for a writer's, blog for a publishing house, and it was on when you hit those blocks. And I was like, I used to think that writer's block meant you didn't have any ideas. And I've since learned that really that's not it. It's really when you lose your way in the story, or, a character's not making sense anymore, or the ending you had planned just isn't working. And so you have a pretty complicated novel, even though it's set over the course of 24 hours. You're really, it's fast moving. There's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of action, because they're coming and going and doing things. So how did you find the process? Finally, you had a novel, you said, come together. So how was it? How long did it take? And what did it, what did it entail to get this thing to gel?
Well, I had one of those moments of very good luck in a way, because the structure came to me pretty early. And I realized I wanted to tell these two different stories over the course of a single day.
Right.
And because I had that structure, it sort of imposed rules on me, but they were very helpful in a way. It took me I can remember this by the age of my kids, because I started it when they were 3, and it came out when they were 8. So I think the writing of it was about 3.5 years. The publication process actually went pretty quickly, from what I understand.
Once you got it, yeah.
Yes, it did. But it's funny because I'm working on something new now, and it's so hard to start something different, and I think that goes to what you were saying about writer's block. It's almost like there are the two kinds of it in a way, like the feeling like, well, I don't have an idea, but there's also the feeling of, I have this idea, and how in the world am I going to make this work? Like, how am I going to make that scene actually happen?
Right.
But I just totally lost track of what I was leading into this. But
well, you know what? Then let's go back to the idea of the book being a 24-hour period. How did that inspiration come to you? Because it's really the urgency of that makes the book really a page turner. Because it's just one thing is happening right after another, and just having been a parent of young children, and lots of them, and feeling that feeling of the tension and the stress and the exhaustion, and knowing it's going to start over again the next day, and just all of the work balancing, it felt really authentic. And I love the 24-hour thing. So talk a little bit more about how that inspiration came to you.
Well, I think it was because at that time when I started working on it, I'm realizing I'm getting a lot of noise also from my apartment too, so which has been part of why
no worries.
But, there was so much happening in every single day at that time. It was juggling my workload, my husband having to juggle his own, taking care of the kids while I'm also working on a journalism project or something else. And, something crazy would happen in the playground or on the street. And, I would have these days when just so much seemed to happen and I couldn't believe that we were making it through. And if a kid was sick or something like that happened, it really could become an all-nighter, like a 24-hour period. And you would get only the smallest of breaks before you would have to wake up and start the whole thing. So even very ordinary days, or what would start as a very ordinary day, would quickly go out of control. Yeah. And that was part of the feeling that I wanted to capture with the book.
Well, you did it really well. And I was thinking back to when my youngest child, my fourth child, was a baby. And by that point, I was back working full time, and so I have a 20-month-old, a newborn, and then a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old, or 6 and 11, or whatever. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And so, and I just remember falling into bed at night and saying, oh, what an accomplishment this day was, you know? And then that brings me to this relationship between Tom and Helen. And I think, thank God my husband and I were on solid ground by the time we hit that point in our marriage where we had 2 little kids, because our other ones are spaced out a little bit, but when the chaos really started to ratchet up, I feel like, and the ability to communicate, and that was something that also rang so authentically true, because it's something I think you always worry about in your relationship when you're so distracted and you're so busy with so many things, you're trying to do it all. Is that the thing that gets lost? And it is sort of something that got lost for Tom and Helen. And I really felt like that was such an authentic, like you almost look at it and go, ooh, it could have been us, in that way. So I liked also that you didn't demonize Tom. Tom is really the one that has the secret. We'll get back to Helen because I want to ask you about her too, but he has the secret, the damaging secret. And we won't give away spoilers, but to say that you told the story from both their perspectives, and it could have easily been, the woman's perspective, the woman wronged or whatever, but you didn't do that. You really told his point of view. And I liked that. I thought it added richness to it, but can you talk a little bit about Tom and his character and how, what his, what you were hoping to achieve by including him so much in the story?
Okay, sure. The situation that he finds himself in, and I'll try to discuss this without any spoilers. You can kind of guess. It's very tricky, but his situation doesn't really have any easy answers. It's hard to, by the point he's at the time the book takes place, it's hard to really advise him and say, okay, here's a clear-cut answer and what you should do. And so, but it was also really important to me that he was a good person, and I think the fact that he loves his family so much and that he's tried to do the right thing and that he has this sort of natural optimism is sort of what causes the problem for him. I think if he were more, strategic, or had an easier time of just cutting off his emotions and making a hard decision, he could have found ways out of this situation earlier, than the point he's in now. So that is part of, it's built into his character. Like I can't see the situation really without him, because then the story doesn't exist in the same way. I wanted to know if somebody who is a really good, decent person who truly loves his family could make a terrible mistake. And if so, like, what happens next? Like, how do they try to get out of it? Like how, without hurting anybody, which is the main thing he wishes to avoid. So I do think he's in a terrible spot.
He is. He's in a bit over his head. And the other thing, and I've read a couple of books that, really sort of focus around this idea of keeping a secret and how damaging a secret can be. And it almost, the stress of it sort of pops through in different ways and almost unexpected ways, like the strain of it. And for Tom, you see the stress. He's distracted. He's not, his mind isn't on, he's, and it's eking through. And I think the secret keeping piece makes for such interesting, you can tell a really good story around a good secret, and that really was, did you start with that idea of, was that a kernel in there, his secret, or did you start from a different place?
Yes, I think the secret was kind of built in from the very start, that, and it's sort of just because he doesn't know what to do and how to handle his problem, he lets it become a secret. Like, in a way, it doesn't have to be, but that's sort of what happens. And it's one of those problems where the longer it remains a secret, the harder it is to get out. Right. So that's where he finds himself. But I also, from very early on, that sort of trance-like state that he gets in, I just saw him, and maybe in a way related to sort of what I was going through at the time as a mom of, two young twins who are running around and dealing with all these work pressures, financial pressures, all those things. Sometimes your problems can be so overwhelming that all you want to do is just trance out, zone away, and hope that it disappears, and the next thing you know, it's 15 minutes later and you're late on your deadline and everything's worse than it was a short time ago. And I see him as somebody who had always been a really good worker, always, pretty organized, on top of things, totally leading, a decent life. But once his problems become more than he can handle, this state of mind he gets in just makes him to make mistake after mistake, and everything starts compounding, and the single day format really shows how a day that can start out fresh and new for him, he thinks, I'm going to do something good, I'm going to take my kids out, we're all up early, we're going to go see the sunrise. A day that starts with a simple idea to do a really nice thing, just it's one thing wrong after another from that moment until the next day.
Right. It sure is. One of the other reasons I think I still continue to like Tom throughout is that there was this, he really loves his wife, and you can feel that through the whole thing. And every time something bad happens, or there's something stressful about the other situation, about his secret, he wants to talk to his wife about it. Like, that's his natural instinct, is to tell her. And he's like, oh wait, I can't tell, that's the problem. Yeah. I can't tell her. And that was sort of, in a strange way, a little bit endearing. And it made you almost want to forgive him, in a way. And I think you peppered and sprinkled enough of that kind of thing into him that he wasn't just this like, oh my God, you've done a terrible thing and betrayed your family. And you can kind of, sort of root for him in a way to, like, hopefully it'll work out, you can't really see how, but you still want that for him. And then there's Helen, and Helen is, she's trying to pull, I can totally relate to her. I'm sure you can too. So, you wrote her with having twins, right? And just that lack of sleep, and the trying to get the job done. And her stress shows itself as anger, right? That's how you sort of that's what you've put in there for her. And it kind of, can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's a really interesting way for it, for a person to exhibit that strain. Other people might drink, other people might, get depressed, or she's angry. So,
she is angry, and she tends to repress her emotions and compartmentalize them. And she sort of pours her anger into her work. She also works very hard. She has a ton to do, so she'll stay up all night on a project, wind up sleep deprived. Sometimes when she's angry, she'll go for a run, or she'll go to the boxing gym. So she doesn't really have an outlet for her anger besides doing more stuff, Right. At the same time, she hasn't ever really let herself experience the anger, really acknowledge or allow herself to have this emotion that she finds negative in a way. And it's not that she's such a positive person, it's just she was raised in such a way that, you don't just let your emotions run wild all over the place. Right. So once things start going wrong from her, and I think she's aware of problems in their life in a way that Tom is not, because he has so many problems that he almost has a tunnel vision around what's going on with him, where she can see that their family's having trouble staying afloat. They both had some downsizing at their jobs. She's aware that, their income isn't meeting their expenses at this point, even though they have a pretty modest lifestyle. They moved to this town, bought a house that she thought would be a really good deal for them, leave the city, move to the Hudson Valley. And then this is kind of set about 2 years after the crash. And so their house isn't worth what they paid for it. And meanwhile, she's no longer happy with the town because she's realizing it's a little bit tougher than she maybe thought it was. And she's feeling isolated now that she's working from home. So she's not really able to process those emotions in a way that would be healthy for her, And and when something goes wrong, like when she has this unexpected, altercation in a playground with a couple of teenagers, because she's repressed her anger for so long, it sort of comes out in the worst possible way.
Right. Right. But it felt really real. I just, that simmering, and you're taught, when you add exhaustion onto anything, you can see that. And I think any mom can appreciate that,
Even now I have.
Yeah. I mean, when we're tired, we just I spiral down, and the smallest thing becomes something overwhelming or whatever. And it just, I really was reading it and saying, okay. Yeah, I remember those feelings. And that's, and I love it when that happens in a book, when there's just, you connect with the characters because your experience has been so spot on, and theirs is matching to yours. So that was great. So let's go back to you a little bit.
Sure.
And you said you were a reporter for a while, and you have a set of twins, and there was things that you put in this book that were, and I had asked you this question in the written interview, and I thought it was interesting. So you can elaborate a little bit, but you said the first time you tried to write something, it wasn't at all.
Oh yes.
You didn't really. And so this one, you kind of you put some things in there that you could relate to. And so we can talk a little bit more about that.
Sure.
That's neat.
Well, okay, so for the first book that I tried to write, it was a crime novel, but it wasn't just a crime novel. It was more like a gritty urban noir, and it was just so far outside of my own experiences. I happen to love crime fiction, and so I was writing what I was interested in, like what I had enthusiasm for. But it was so hard to get the material. I was still pouring everything from my own life into it, like apartments I lived in or incidents that happened to me on the subway. And that part's always a lot of fun. But it was so difficult. It was almost like I'd set myself up with just an insurmountable task, like saying, okay, I'm going to write a novel about 18th century Russia. Like, okay, I could, but like that, I really have to start, doing a ton of research. So after I finally reached a point where I felt, you know what, I'm going to put this aside. I decided to make things a lot easier for myself. And when I said, like, I remember when I started writing it, because of the age of my kids, I decided to keep things like that consistent. Like you don't really feel it in the book, but like Helen's age and the birthdays of the kids pretty much correspond to my actual birthday or, and how old my kids were at the time. I was writing it. It was a few years after the crash. Like all those things were so recent, and clear to me that I was able to draw on them very easily. So I borrowed from my job. For my newswire job, I'd also worked at a magazine, a couple different magazines. So, and Tom also had some work magazines, so I was able to borrow from that. I think that's graphic design related and art related. I borrowed from my husband. Who has had those types of jobs. Helen works for a company that markets, they're like nutritional supplements that help you become a better bodybuilder. And some of that, just from various jobs my husband has had over the years, like I had been hearing it for so long that I was able to draw on these.
You can just put it in there and you don't have to really think as much. It just comes out.
Yeah.
It feels real.
It was helpful to have the material at hand rather than having to go out in the field. I love going out and like doing research on locations and things like that. But I did decide to make things a little bit easier.
So will you ever go back to writing a different kind of a genre, do you think?
I do. I'm working on a couple different things. What's that?
Back to your crime fiction. Now that you've actually finished something, does that seem like you could return to it? Maybe.
Yeah, I'm working on something that's definitely in the same, contemporary literary genre, and it has a mother and a daughter, so things that are familiar to me, although there are also aspects of this that I'm having to research, and those parts are complicated, and they're always frustrating, and I've had to remind myself, I finally remembered what I was thinking about before, because we were talking about, I was like, eventually it'll come back. Yep. We were talking about writer's block and how hard things were. Now that I'm working on something new, to cheer myself up a little bit, I actually went back to my first notebooks to say, like, well, how bad was this when I started? Like, how close is it now? Like, the actual printed book to what it first looked like. And I had forgotten all sorts of things. Like, there were 2 couples in my very first version. That's so different. All the names are different. So all these different things. And it was a little reassuring to say, okay, there is this messy period where there are characters and storylines that just all follow away. Like the chapter 1 of Small Hours changed a million times before I even sent it out the first time. So I'm giving myself a break with that, but it does help to actually go back and see it.
And realize that there's a process.
There is a process, and you can't speed it up. So in terms of what I'm working on now, like when I reach those points where I say, okay, I have to get the research, there's parts that I'm missing that I need to find out. I remember that, even with this book, I had to go find a lawyer and have him work through a case for me, because I thought I understood from researching online, like how some of these details would play out, but it's actually very complicated. So like there were months of talking, to lawyers and having phone calls and things like that. With a very patient lawyer who walked me through all the different steps. So I am doing that. And I also really love psychological suspense, like that particular part of crime fiction, which is not as hard to write about as like organized crime, for me, but which is what I was kind of trying the first time.
That's a bit more plot heavy, and this is more character driven.
Yeah. I like that feeling of tension and dread and suspense. So maybe I could work on something that's a little bit of a crossover there.
That's fun. So you were a news wire reporter. So have you always wanted to do fiction as well? Or was that something that came later? How was your path from there to here?
Well, jagged, a lot of ups and downs and backwards. Sure. But I had always wanted to write. I took a lot of fiction writing courses as an undergraduate. And then, I graduated and it's like, well, what do I do? I need an actual job. But first I went and got an MFA in Scotland, and that was a lot of fun. But again, it's not a job,
Right.
And I came back. Yeah, and I was like, it doesn't lead to something. Fiction writing is not an actual job, I've learned. And but when I came back, it was sort of like the .com boom was starting. I'm really aging myself. But I worked for a startup in Philadelphia. And through a person I met there, I wound up getting the job in New York City first at Bloomberg.com and then as a newswire reporter. So that was how I managed to move into news. I really wanted to at that point. I knew I wanted to write. I also like the idea in journalism that the plots are already there. You're just finding out the information. It's sort of like they've done the hard part for you. So, and I love that idea, but it's very hard to break in. And I got a chance through Bloomberg. And then I went to journalism school. I keep going back. So I went to journalism school and started doing longer pieces that way. And then writing for various.
And now do you do any of that type of work now, or are you all fiction?
No, I still do a lot of writing, but it's mostly for universities because, and that's also just one of those stumbling into it kind of things. When I was at Columbia's journalism school, I started writing for their business school through a different friend. And that set me up with actually a job, which was really nice because they paid for the journalism.
Overrated.
Jobs are nice. And paying for school is great too, especially when pretty much magazine journalism collapsed like 3 years later, like right after I got my degree. So it was really nice that I didn't have like a ton of loans from that experience.
Sure. It is. But it's an interesting path, And
it is. Yeah.
No two peoples are the same. And I think readers they always seem to be fascinated. I find that the questions that I would get from others are like, so how did, what does it look like to be a writer, And I'm like, well, it's ask anybody and it'll be a different answer. And I think it's really interesting for you to go, keep going. Your story is fascinating, but I just like, that's true. There's not one right way. There's not one only way. And what does a day-to-day, what does it look like as a day-to-day in Jennifer's life,
Well, it's funny because there is no one path, it's not the kind of job where you can get a degree and a credential and it's like, now you're licensed to write, and you can write a book, So I especially after journalism school, I was happy to write for whoever needed writing. I sort of considered myself a writer at large, for universities. And that's still who, in terms of a day job, who I mostly work for, various universities in New York. I write for the University of Buffalo because a friend of mine from Philly wound up moving to Buffalo. So I've been fortunate to have people move around a little bit here and there, and they sort of take me with them. And I can, and it's fun. I love doing that kind of work because I like writing about research, subjects I've never even heard of, or profiling somebody who has a job that it has never occurred to me before. So I think for a writer especially, because it's very isolating. Writing is just you by yourself in this room with nothing in it.
Exactly.
And so you can
me and my flower picture behind me.
I know. I need to get a flower picture. Clearly, there's actually stuff on the other walls. You can't see it, but there's a bookshelf here with tons of books, and there's one there too. But this is just as blank as the one behind me.
So
there's a window.
It's fine.
Yeah, the front and back, there's nothing, and there is that window, but it's the curtain's always in front of it. So, but yeah, so being able to do that kind of writing is a way to keep in contact with people, to be exposed to people who I might not ever meet, and they're all doing interesting things that they're so passionate about. And that's always fun, to talk to somebody about and to write about.
It's good to have colleagues, no matter what field you're in. It's good to have colleagues because it is, especially it is so lonely. You spend most of your time in your own head. And, either you're creating or you're researching or you're actually doing, and it's good to have a tribe.
Yeah. And I also like work, and I like writing about work. And if you don't do any, or meet people, like you become unable to write about work, and it's funny how many books I read where somebody had, they're a teacher at a college, and it's like, of course, because a lot of writers are teachers at colleges, but there are more jobs out there. So I like being able to interact,
Right. So we have time for just about one more question. And so I'm going to ask you, how do you find, so you write in the fiction realm and you write in the nonfiction realm. Mm-hmm. And what do you find, I don't want to say what do you like better, but what are the pros and the cons of each? What are the joys and the, and the challenges of each? I'm sure they're a little bit different for each one.
Well, I guess in terms of nonfiction, I guess the really nice part is, the story is there. You get to talk to somebody, the challenge is really figuring out how to tell it. Because everybody, if I'm profiling somebody, I feel like I could profile just about anybody at this point because I've done it for so long. So it's both fun and challenging to get that story out of the person because sometimes it's not the first story they'll tell you, like sometimes
the thread comes later, that interesting thing comes,
It can take a while. I mean, some people, it's almost like they've been media trained so much and they'll just tell you what you want to hear. But it's also interesting to talk to people who haven't really been interviewed before, and you're learning something really new, and you get to see something about their life, that they might not have seen or that is interesting in some way. So that would be both the challenge and the fun part of it. Fiction to me just feels so different. The most fun part for me is always when you're thinking of like what can happen, and like the idea is sort of just spitting out, and maybe that doesn't work, so it's okay, let's go back a little bit and see if it goes this path a little bit better. And then the hard part is, okay, you have this vision in your head and it feels right, and then it's like, here's my typewriter, or here's my computer, and I have to get that scene onto the page in a way that captures that feeling or shows this series of events. And that can be very complicated, just including the right amount of details, or creating a mood. It's just, that is always the tricky part. The better part is after you've had a couple or a few or many drafts of that, and it starts coming together and you're like, oh, thank God, like I can actually read the paragraph.
Here. Yeah.
Yeah, no. Sometimes I'm like, if a paragraph or something, like, yes, time for lunch.
I know. And I was just writing that blog today, and I'm actually in the middle of writing about my third one. And I'm hitting that spot of, wait, I'm not sure. I don't know,
Oh, that's the terrifying feeling. Yes.
Terrifying. And so I'm writing this blog, and I'm writing it for as much myself as I am for anybody else. I'm like, it's okay. Everybody feels this way. You'll get through it. Here are some tips,
Yeah.
And I just think,
that's why I save my notebooks.
Yeah. So you can go back and say, oh, it was really that bad. The first draft was as bad in that book as it is in this one. And it turned out okay.
It's very reassuring to see that. And I read a lot of author interviews just to hear that, just to hear this kind of a near universal experience that everybody
And that's why we need our tribe.
Can't look at that again, like terrifying.
Yeah, we need that tribe to remind us, like,
yes,
that is
definitely
nothing you see on the shelf came out like that. It's all a labor of love. Yeah. So you said you started this book when your kids were 2 and you finished it when they were 8. So you finished it when
3. Yeah.
3.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot of years of writing.
It was. Yeah. It was about, I feel like the writing part was about 3.5, but in a way, to me, considering what I had gone through before with the book that I finally managed to put aside, I was like, that was quick. You know?
Right.
And I guess, you know, I know people, I have a lot of mystery writer friends who can write a book a year, and I'm amazed. You know, they're just so prolific, you know.
Yeah, the
and
people that put out those, you know, have a couple thousand words a day, and then they're putting out a book
yeah,
a quarter, you know, or a book every 6 months.
yeah, it's amazing to me. I have a horror fiction friend who does that too. He has a book out, and they're all standalones. So that's not even a mystery series. He's coming up with a completely different world every year and publishing it. And all I can think of as an explanation for that is that their first drafts must be a lot better than mine. You know,
It must be. I know. I feel the same way. I'm always
it must come closer to the finished product. You know?
Right, right. But it's fun. But, you know, I think it's interesting. And I ask our authors that come on because, you know, it's readers that are mostly listening to us. And I think it's really fun. And I think they think it's really fun to get inside, you know, the writer's head and their process and think, oh, wow, it did take, you know, and I appreciate, you know, having labored through years ago through writing a book, I appreciate a book so much more in a way, a well-done book. Like I read it and I'm like, oh, what a good job they did.
I know.
That must have been so complicated to do that, you know, to put that all together, you know?
When I was going through the publishing process and like all of like the copy editing and the proofs and all of these different stages, I mean, I don't know how many books I actually have, but we have a ton of books in the apartment. And I would look at the shelves and say, oh my God, did all of these books go through this? Like, good work, everybody. Like, that was a ton of effort to get these books out. And I would look at books that were like 600 or 700 pages long and just wonder, how in the world did somebody edit that? Like, not just the editor.
When I read The Goldfinch.
Yes, that's right over there.
But who edited this book? And how did they keep track? And how does this work when you go to that extent? I'm in awe.
I'm actually very curious about that. How many years?
Well, if I ever get an author that writes that, I'll be sure and ping you, and I'll be like, listen, you got to listen. I'm talking to them tonight.
I would like an answer. That would be great.
All right. Well, we are at time, a little bit over. So thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on this evening. And once I hit the button, we're gonna be off. So have a great night, and thank you again.
Okay. Thank you so much too.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
There we go.